Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 139th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today, our panel will discuss America's role, if any, in the political turmoil in Venezuela. For the past 2 years, our Justice Department has been investigating possible Russian interference in our 2016 presidential election. Meanwhile, our government has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela to pressure President Maduro to step down. Our question is this a double standard? Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. And on his left is Patty Haskins, member of the Wadsworth City Council. Nicolas Maduro was elected president of Venezuela in April of 2013 and has ruled by decree, more or less, ever since, with something close to dictatorial powers. The Venezuelan economy is in tatters and the country is near rebellion. The crises in human suffering is at an all-time high. Taking all this into consideration, is the U.S. justified in trying to influence a change of power in Venezuela?
John, I'm thinking about this question. I didn't really know anything about Venezuela particularly. Yeah. So I went and looked. Yeah. And it was colonized by the Spaniards in 1522. And by 1821, they were really part of Colombia, but in 1830 they achieved full independence in the country. And since then it's been up and down. It's been, it was firstly an agrarian economy with cacao and coffee, but then shortly after World War I, oil was discovered. And it's apparently the largest oil reserve in the world in Venezuela. And that's caused both good and ill. And over the years, there have been a series of presidents and legislatures that have been more or less dictatorial and populist. About the time Maduro took over, there had been, of course, an oil crisis in 1973, and that's left Venezuela in a good position. And GDP went way up, and everyone was doing pretty well. But then under Chavez and also under Maduro, that instituted a lot of pretty much socialism in a way. Social things went on, and standard of living was raised and so on. But unfortunately, they didn't pay much attention to the actual wealth of the country, and the whole infrastructure began to crumble and that sort of thing. And so now we got rampant. I've looked up a little bit about what Chavez has done. It just destabilized the economy, really, but by 2013. Hyperinflation, depressed economy, shortages of basic goods. So that's been going on. In 2014, the oil prices dropped, which completely destroyed them. Declared in 2017 a constitutional crisis. And the Supreme Tribunal, which was Maduro aligned, took over from the National Assembly and pretty much negated all their stuff.
This is sort of like their Supreme Court.
This is the elective government. In 2017, the Constituent National Assembly held an election and completely stripped the National Assembly of its powers. In 2017, Maduro declared that the leading opposition parties would not be allowed to participate in the coming election.
Who declared that?
Maduro.
Maduro did, yes.
Yes,
okay.
Because they had neglected a campaign by the mayors for information. So after the election, Maduro was elected by 67% of the vote. Pretty good. Countries like China and Russia and a number of others have supported him, and a great many other countries and throughout South and Central America and the United States have declared this is an invalid election. And in fact, in January of this year, the Association of the OAS, Associated Nation of American States, declared this election was not legitimate. And since then, the Chinese have kind of stepped back a little bit. They're still supporting him, but they're saying they're keeping an open mind. Russia has kind of stopped supporting the government in terms of sending money.
Well, they're running out too.
Yeah, they're running out too. Just this morning in the paper, I saw that the military, although some people have defected from the military has closed off a bridge over to Colombia to block the shipment in of some humanitarian goods.
Saw that.
So, is it a double standard? We're worried about the Russians interfering in us, and we have a pretty good history of supporting dictators and interfering in other countries to suit our own means. Just happened to watching a program last night on Franco, and since he was such a strong anti-communist, although he was a real monster, people like Dwight Eisenhower went and visited him and embraced him because he was an anti-communist.
Well, the Pope sort of embraced the Nazis because they were opposed to communism.
Right. So same idea.
To let him alone. Yeah.
Is it justified? Well, that's a broader philosophical question, isn't it?
Well, that's what you're good at.
Yeah. Well, I think it is in this case. I think at least to continue with aid and to continue with sanctions as such, I don't know exactly what we mean here. Sanctions, I'm a little bit worried about. It never seems to hurt the people on the top, except indirectly, of course.
In this case, it probably does, because the sanctions are mainly against people.
Yeah.
And very little as far as oil is concerned, which is their chief economic trade with us.
Right.
So forth. Well, Bryan, where do you come from on this issue?
You know, I'm glad Ron laid it out very well. I agree 100%. I think socialism did this to this country, not sanctions. As you mentioned, the sanctions were personalized. Individuals in the government did not reach down into the the economy in general. Venezuela, what was it, 25 or 30 years ago, was one of the wealthiest oil-producing countries in the world. Ron gave a very good narrative of Mr. Chavez and his style of socialism. It started out very, it's the old story of the frog in the pot. He was elected, and his first term, everything was great because oil prices would support his spending. His second term, he started to turn up the heat. He started to use some of the same rhetoric that we hear out of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. It's a class warfare. The rich, the economy is not equal. There's inequality in the country, and we can't have this. And he started to turn the population against the very golden goose that was creating the wealth in the country. His third term, he went bonkers. And he started to nationalize businesses. He started to kick people out of the country that could actually, the technology to bring the oil up. You know, if you're sitting on the oil, it just doesn't come bubbling up like the Beverly Hillbillies, you know. Yeah. It's not Jed Clampett out there and all of a sudden you see some. Yeah. Exactly. You have to have the technology where all those people left. Mm-hmm. So they were struggling just to get their oil to market. And this put a real crimp on his spending. And then all of a sudden, when they couldn't even provide the basic needs, you know, the average Venezuelan has lost over 20 pounds. They lose over 10 pounds a year just because they can't get bread and milk. And for the longest time, you know, our Hollywood elite and some of the folks in the socialist movement, and I want to make sure Patty is not a socialist. I don't believe Patty is a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and we can argue all day long about that. But there is an element in the country today, Bernie Sanders represents that. The young lady that just was elected, AOC, Alexandria Cortez, is a socialist pretending to be a Democrat. And they use some of the same tactics that Chavez, and I think people need to wake up to that, is that Maduro and Chavez used that tactic to ingrain themselves into the people's psyche. And all of a sudden now we've got a humanitarian crisis. The people are leaving that country. It's probably worse than Syria. You know, over 3 million people have left
Venezuela.
Which started really
Yeah.
sometime before this.
Sometime before that. This notion that somehow socialism works, it doesn't, because this is the result of the same type of socialism that we're being fed, the millennials are being fed, spoon-fed, by the Bernie Sanders of the world, and it doesn't work.
There's an old expression that when you rob Peter to pay Paul, you can always depend on the support of Paul.
Exactly.
And I think that a lot of politicians now, all they care about is the next election.
Right.
And that they depend on the support of Paul. Paul doesn't care about 20 years from now.
No.
All Paul cares about is give me the free stuff.
And that's where we're at today. We have to do something in that country so that those people can stay there and live and bring that economy back. They still have the oil; it hasn't gone anywhere. We've got to take the top off and we got to start over again. I think they've done the right thing, and I would hope that people on the left, as well as some of the extremes on the right, will get together and say that was the right thing to do, was to basically say we no longer recognize your government as legitimate. We recognize this particular, the young man that they have designated, the president of the Senate, or he was elected.
I thought it was Guido.
But that country has got to come back on, because there aren't enough resources in the world to support a Venezuelan population. We're strained as it is, and so I applaud those particular efforts, and I hope everybody, right or left or whatever, will say that's not what we want, and it's played out right in front of our eyes. This is the result of socialism, and it does not work. And people are sort of, Bernie Sanders hasn't said a word about it. He was there. He loved Chavez. This was the new socialism. This was going to be different, and it's not. It's the same thing, and it gives you the same results.
Worked for a while.
It worked.
Long as the price of oil.
Well, and what Margaret Thatcher said, it says, socialism works until you run out of spending other people's money or something like that.
Yeah.
And that
basically, which is what happened.
And that's what happened. They have 1 million. Their inflation is over 1,000,000%.
Yeah.
I heard last night 1.7 million.
Yeah.
Percent.
And that's all because of the ham-handed, the ham-fisted way that they handled their economy, the way they decided that they were going to basically control industries. They were going to dictate how people were paid. Oh, they raised minimum wage down there 3 or 4 times.
Yes.
Oh, they gave them free health care. They had free tuition. They had every socialist dream happening in Venezuela, but the minute they ran out of money, that all stopped.
Yeah. Because they had
I read one article where they said that the middle to lower class people in Venezuela are competing with wild dogs, rats, and flies for food.
eating, basically dumpster diving.
Yes. Patty, what do you think?
Well, first of all, no, I'm not a socialist.
I know you're not, Patty.
The socialism that's in Venezuela is not European-style socialism, and I think we have to say that, and that we do not have people in this country looking for a Venezuelan-type situation. It wasn't, I don't think, socialism that killed Venezuela. It was corruption and a dictatorship that did it. You can have socialism without having that. It was interesting, I just heard on Fox this morning, and I've heard this figure before, that according to a Gallup poll, when they polled 18 to 29-year-olds, 51% have a favorable view of socialism. 45% have a favorable view of capitalism, which is kind of interesting in the way our younger people are thinking.
They're not thinking, they're responding to their
what's
own
going
nervous
to,
system.
free college and all of these other things.
Question that was asked.
One of the things, when we talk about what do we do, I always have fear when we look into United States looking at a regime change, because it hasn't always worked out that well. I mean, I think, the most famous one for me, or infamous, I guess, would be, we supported Castro over Batista. And that turned out really wonderful. So sometimes I'm not sure that we should become involved in these. Venezuela's got some interesting situations because they have, right now, they have over 100 billion in loans out to various countries. And they're not, they're in debt to those countries. Over 20 billion is to to China, and
I heard it was 60 billion to China.
I
That's what
read 20.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And Russia's like 2.3 billion, which isn't that much. But you know, the problem is if is his name pronounced Guaido?
Guaido,
Guaido.
G-A-I-D-O.
Yeah, and I didn't know how to pronounce it. Guaido takes over. You know, Russia could say, okay, you don't pay us back, and there's concern whether he would pay back those loans if he were to take over, which is one of the reasons that China and Russia were balking at supporting a regime change. He said he would, but it's questionable whether he would be able to. And the concern with Russia is that they have some rights, according to the loan agreement, to take over some of the oil-based industries within Venezuela, one of which is a U.S.-based Citco. And Russia would hold 49.9% of the ownership of this U.S.-based oil company in Venezuela. And that should have some concerns for the United States. Now, they're not...
Term unintended consequences.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of those things where they're not as concerned about this as Maduro stays in power, but if the new guy comes in, what is he going to do, and what's going to happen in Venezuela? I mean, I have real mixed feelings on this because I don't like the idea of our participating in regime changes. However, you know, when you see the people suffering and what's going on, there's a humanitarian way to handle this. I mean, I know it's been suggested that we send troops down there to overthrow the government. I really don't think that that's the best course of
We'll
action.
circle around to that in a minute or two. There are a couple of points I wanted to make, though, before we do that. When I think back to the 70s, there was an organization in Wadsworth called, forget the name of it right now, but it was headed up by a lovely woman named Tommy Danforth. I don't know, you remember her? Experiment in International Living, it was called. And what they did was sponsor a whole flock of students to come to the United States. And there were quite a few in Wadsworth, including the Grom family, that had students living with us for a period of time. And these were students that were sponsored by the government of Venezuela. But it was kind of an interesting, almost a Republican view of how to manage these things. The students were completely supported by the government, but here's the deal. If they ever flunked out, if they ever flunked a course in college, their parents had to pay back all the money that had been invested in them up to that point. So I know that Franklin Kiatha, who lived with us, he was a nervous kid. I mean, he really studied. He was one of 9 children. His father worked for a Cure Oil company in Maracaibo, and that there was no way in the world that, in fact, when he was living with us, the family was really celebrating. Dad just bought a '59 Ford. This was in the 70s. I mean, so there was no way they could pay it all back. The other thing I wanted to point out, when you look at there are some very, very wealthy countries in the world when you think of what's in the ground: oil, gold, different minerals and all of that.
Venezuela's got all of that.
But they've never been able to organize around getting it out of the ground and using it. But in the 70s, I don't know who the president was in Venezuela at the time, but supporting these kids was part of a very ambitious program to build on the oil wealth and to have good long-term wealth creation in the country. But
well, it was really quite a popular thing. I had a graduate school compatriot who was involved in the petroleum world, and his goal was, as soon as graduation happened, he was a single guy, he was heading for Venezuela. He says, I'll put 5 to 6 years down there and I'll come home wealthy. Because the wages were very high, and oil
How
was
much
good.
oil do we get from Venezuela at this point?
Very little.
It's really cut down,
But it's
hasn't it?
40% of their oil. 40% of their exports go to the United States. And the question is, why would they sell it to us if they hate us so darn much? One of the reasons is that the United States pays cash, and nobody else does. In fact, some countries that they export to don't pay at all.
It's interesting too that during the 70s, when oil prices were good, and the country received a large influx of people from all over the world, and it's one of the most diverse populations around, at least in South America.
But even back then, they had a huge underclass. They were referred to as the marginales. And I know that Caracas is apparently a city on a hill, and all the foothills or whatever surrounding, just loaded with tar paper shacks and hovels and all were the marginales.
The United States has had a large industrial impact in Venezuela, though. I mean, as early as the 50s. I know my uncle worked there, and he and my aunt lived there for 2-3 years with an American-based company. So,
okay, here's a question. If we were to accept the fact that we have this humanitarian responsibility to do something to upgrade the lives of the people in Venezuela, how do we do it? Pat, you mentioned the fact that you would not be in favor of any kind of military assistance.
I'm leery of, of attacking the country to impose the change in government.
We already have 150,000 troops stationed around the world. We have 165,000 troops stationed around the world in 150 countries. And wondering, what would we do? I mean, if we were to do some kind of a military intervention in Venezuela, are we going to have troops there for the next 50 years or 100 years?
I don't think there's any reason to believe that we're going to go down there and have some sort of military footprint. What we can't do is leave those people hanging. We cannot give our support and then withdraw our support. We saw that with the Arab Spring, when certain Arab countries decided they wanted to make a break for democracy. We talked the show, and then all of a sudden, we weren't there anymore. There was no longer any, figurative air cover for democracy to actually grow within the country. There was a groundswell, and there was enough pressure put on their governments not to react militarily as a police state and start to shoot at people, but it stopped. And we can't do that with Venezuela. We cannot allow Maduro, he has one way to go, and that's out. And he can like, I think John Bolton had a little thing, I didn't get to read the whole thing, but he said, he can retire on a Caribbean island somewhere, we'll never bother him again.
Bolton's kind of in favor of taking military.
That's the easy way.
Yeah.
You can do it the easy way or the hard way. And
well, we've tried military, we've tried economic sanctions all over Iran is a.
They don't work. Yeah.
So we're still in the same situation in Iran. And to your point, what year was it that there was a popular uprising in Iran? And just a little bit of support, just even vocal support from the United States would have swung it.
Right, and it didn't happen.
No, they didn't get. They didn't
have it. So they were left high and dry, and so the regime was able to go in there and basically, kill most of them, push most of them out of the country.
Well,
I don't think we can do that with Venezuela. We have to let those people know that we're there to help them and support them and give them the figurative air cover that they need so that they can have a groundswell. I mean, some of the pictures that were coming out, there were millions of people, in the street protesting.
Maduro still has the support of the military, and that's in Venezuela, and that's the
Ron
scary
pointed
part.
out, though, that some of the military are defecting.
At least one I heard of, anyway, a very high-level guy.
Yeah.
And of course, they're asking for more of it to happen.
Right, and they want to make sure, and there's all the calculus that goes in. It's like, listen, if you continue to do this, then you're going to get brought up on war crimes. It's almost like we're plea bargaining with them. They know what they did was wrong, so you can either accept the deal and go away and let the country begin to heal, or we'll take other measures. And there's enough countries in that area that have signed on because they don't want this. I mean, they cannot support 3 million people, 3 million Venezuelans leaving. We have to help those people in place.
China could make the difference in this, though.
China?
They are the
Exactly.
and this is true with so many countries, whether
North
it's
Korea,
North Korea
exactly,
or whether
exactly.
it's Venezuela. China could be the ones that make the decision and that could alter the situation in Venezuela.
And that would go a long way in our relationship with China. Russia can tell Cuba. Cuba's got a lot of military advisors and political advisors in Venezuela, sowing the seeds of the sort of the Cuban way of doing things. And all Russia has to do is say the word, and those people will leave. And Russia can step back and say, we know you owe us 20 billion, whatever it is, it's a big number. Let's work out a way for you to repay that and do it without bloodshed. Because, Maduro has there's no restraint when it comes to his population and killing people.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Just the latest news, you referred to it earlier, all the humanitarian aid being blocked on that bridge.
Right.
Does that seem to you like maybe, a bridge too far? It's an outrage that people are just not going to be able to tolerate.
Well, let's see what happens.
Yeah. And in the meantime, thank you very much for another exciting discussion. See you all in 2 weeks.
Yep.